Welcome to New Possibilities. I speak truth to power without fear. Today I'm going to do a book review, and it's been a while since I've done one. And I had been meaning to do this book review for some time, and I finally finished the book. I finally finished reading it, and I'm glad that I did. I'm glad that I picked this book up. The name of the book is The Destruction of Black Civilization by Chancellor Williams. This book is excellent. It is truly, one of those key books that every African American should read at least once. It is a book that I encourage people to pass on to their children. It's something that, a book that I meant to read like some time ago when I was in college. This book has a lot of information in it. It answers some of the questions that many of us have been asking. We often hear about our greatness as a people. We hear about the things that we accomplished as a people. And when we hear about these great things, and we read about these things, and we watch documentaries about these accomplishments, the question often comes to mind: how did we come from being the master builders of civilization? How did we come from being the cream of the earth, the inventors of everything that makes people human? How did we go from that great state to the low state that we see ourselves in today? No matter where you are on the face of the earth, whether you're in America, whether you're in Europe or in South America or in the Middle East, wherever the black man finds himself or herself, the black woman finds herself, black people are at the bottom rung of society. And the question is, how did we get there? And this book answers that question in part. In fact, this book demands further investigation, further research. It demands that we continue to plot a course to gather more information about our past so that we can build our future. This book talks about our greatness as a people. It talks about the great empires, the great civilizations that black people built. It talks about how we were the first people to invent mathematics and science and medicine and written language. And it talks about the fundamental role that African people played in the development of philosophy and religion. And it even points out how the Greeks learned a lot of things from African civilizations. It points out how the Greeks looked upon the African, the black man, as an extraordinary race, as a great people, as a mighty people. That's how we were perceived at one point. We weren't perceived as the N-word. We weren't perceived as thugs, as gangsters. We were perceived as the builders of civilization, because that's what we were. And that's what we have the potential of becoming once again. So this book takes us through the history. It talks about these great civilizations in Egypt, in Ethiopia, in Sudan. It talks about great African civilizations on the west coast of Africa. Civilizations like the Ghana Empire and the Mali Empire. It talks about the different kings and queens. It talks about southern African civilizations as well. And it talks about the spirit of resistance that we have as a people. People often have this false notion that somehow Africans are a passive people, a docile people, a people fit to be slaves. Those are lies. When you look into the history, you see that we have a history of resistance. We have a history of greatness. We have a history of resilience and survival. No other people on the face of the earth could have faced what we faced and still survived. We are a great and mighty people, and this book points that out. But this book goes beyond just talking about how great we are as a people. It goes beyond that, and it talks about how we actually fell from greatness. And it provides examples over centuries and over thousands of years. It talks about how white people were able to infiltrate black civilizations and undermine them and eventually destroy them. And one of the key points that this book raises, after analyzing how all these great civilizations fell, one point that the author brings up is the whole issue of the white man. And after analyzing history over all these periods of time, over hundreds and thousands of years, Chancellor Williams concludes that the white man is not to be trusted, that the white man is basically the enemy of black people. And he doesn't do this, reach this conclusion in some kind of rhetorical kind of way or emotional kind of way. He reaches this conclusion by looking at how our civilizations fell, from the great Egyptian civilizations all the way to our Western African civilizations and Southern African civilizations. Each time, the white man gradually wormed his way into these civilizations. He earned the trust of African people. Each time we've allowed the white man to eventually gain control over the trade in our nations. He had access to the coastal lines of Egypt, and eventually he ended up having control over the economy in Egypt. And the same story plays out over and over all over Africa, where gradually the white man is allowed into communities. The white man ends up taking over the economy and eventually taking over the politics of those communities. Whether it's ancient Egypt or if it's black communities today, it's the same scenario played out over and over again throughout history. And he points this out. And he also talks about some of the weaknesses of African Americans and Africans in general that make this possible. He talks about disunity, how the lack of strong, organized leadership is what contributes to our downfall as a people. It is what has allowed these other people to rule over us. So this book is a very powerful book. It's a book that I highly recommend that everyone read. And one thing that he touches on, he talks about the role of mulattoes and how they were basically used to maintain control over black people, how they were used to perpetuate white supremacy. And it's just something that we should reflect upon. But as he makes that point, he also talks about how there were plenty of mulattoes that were committed to their people, committed to black people, that did not betray their people. But that whole point about the role of mulattoes, and early on in the book, he talks about how eventually whites were able to intermingle with Africans, and their offspring would often find themselves in positions of power through intermarriage and commingling. And instead of those biracial children being committed to their black brothers and sisters, they were more loyal to their European fathers, or Arab fathers for that matter. And eventually they ended up controlling a lot of African societies. And as they controlled, gained dominance and power in black communities and nations, many of our people were forced out because of conflicts. And as they left and migrated out of these centers of learning, these centers of civilization, they were forced by the conditions to live in a way that wasn't up to the same standard as their original empires. They were basically fragmented and forced to establish new communities under harsh physical conditions. The environment was hostile. Many people died during these migrations. And it's a pattern that repeats itself over and over, all over the continent. And this fragmentation, this war and conflict that Africans faced eventually led to the decline of our civilization as a people. Here we are, the people who invented written language. Eventually, we lost that written language. Eventually, we were a people that spoke different languages, but we had common languages amongst us. We were able to communicate, but with these fragmentations and this conflict, we were broken up into smaller communities, adopted new languages, and many of these languages were not written. So it's a long process of decline, and that's what Chancellor Williams points out in his book. He really talks about how these foreigners, how these white people and Arabs were able to divide African people and conquer them. It was a gradual process. In particular, he talked about what happened in Angola, in the area of Angola. How they had African people fighting each other. And that's one thing that he pointed out. He talked about how many of these African civilizations thrived until the point when they allowed the white man into their communities. Until the point when they allowed Arabs into their communities and all these other non-African people into the community. Gradually, over time, those communities became weaker, they became divided, and these outsiders exploited those divisions. And from what I remember, I think it was Angola that he talked about. He talked about how African people would trade. First of all, they were in conflict with each other. And the white man would give guns to both sides and have rival factions killing each other, killing and destroying each other. They would actually purchase guns by exchanging their brothers and sisters, by putting their brothers and sisters into bondage. So when they would bring the white man slaves or captives, the white man would give them guns in exchange. And that just produced an environment that promotes fratricide, where black people were killing each other. And we see these problems today. I mean, you see the disunity, the same kind of disunity that Chancellor Williams talked about in his book. You see that disunity manifest itself today. Whether you're talking about the conflict between rival gangs in our community, people fighting over land and streets that they don't even own, claiming blocks and wearing colors and killing one another over drugs, over territory. much how our ancestors killed each other, fought with each other in the same kind of way. There's a lot of analogies that can be drawn between the drug trade and the slave trade. Both economies are destructive to the community. Both economies have a cannibalistic nature to them, where it's like people think they're getting ahead, but really what they're doing is destroying their own community. Like the kings that would trade in their own people for weapons. They thought that they were getting power through those weapons, but really they were destroying themselves and destroying their own communities. Just like these young brothers who don't have hope. They don't have any hope for the future. They don't see any jobs out there. They don't have a quality education. They don't have access to those things. They don't see any possibility of making their life better through legitimate means. So they end up being a part of the drug economy. And the drug economy destroys the community. It destroys the drug addict and it destroys the drug dealers. Because the drug dealer has to wage war against his brother in order to survive. And for those who aren't killed, they are the ones who get incarcerated. So you have a problem of mass incarceration. You have a problem of mass death in our communities. It's the same kind of destruction that Chancellor Williams talked about when he was talking about our ancient civilizations. It's the same type of destruction.